After 15 years of marriage, Paul Miller had taken a bold young woman outside. I asked PaShe came to me, cradling her belly, demanding a rightful place. With age creeping up and half your body already in the ground, you don't even have a son to see you off. Why do you think you can keep your position as his wife? I asked Paul, who stood behind her, with a hint of interest. What do you think? He dared not speak. If I, the daughter of a military family, turned against him, that little girl would have to cry quietly. Ding! Royal Story reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. On the 15th of each month, I would accompany my mother-in-law to the National Protection Temple to pray for blessings, as is our custom. Since I had no regrets in life and sought nothing more, I would hide in the backyard early to pass the time. By chance, I encountered an interesting young girl who held a bowl of bird's nest porridge, her eyes sparkling. He always worries too much. With such a large temple, how could it ever starve me and his son? As she spoke, she absently caressed her barely noticeable belly, her face radiating the tenderness and joy of being a new mother. Noticing me watching her, she shyly nodded in my direction. Then she casually asked, "How old are your children, madam? Do they ever cause you as much trouble as the little rascal in my belly, leaving you unable to eat or sleep?" In this entire capital city, which noblewoman didn't know that I, Melina Stewart, couldn't bear children? It was rare for someone to come to me and touch such a sensitive subject. Yet her eyes were calm, eagerly awaiting my response. I smiled faintly, replying politely, "My luck is thin, I have never given birth." She sighed in apparent regret. "That's really too bad, being a mother is a happy thing." Seeing that I smiled but didn't reply, she continued on her own. The National Protection Temple is very effective for praying for children. If a couple goes together and hangs a prayer strip high, they are sure to have their wishes granted. I came to fulfill my wish and give thanks. Why don't you give it a try? My heart tightened as I looked deeply at her. I cannot bear children, and my husband does not wish for it either. Otherwise, taking a few concubines would not be difficult at all. Her smile faltered, and she forced a smile. "Surely your husband loves you very much." "Yes, Paul Miller once loved me very much." In the 3rd year of our marriage, when the imperial doctor declared we were destined to have no offspring, I tentatively asked to leave the marriage. Paul burst into the palace like a madman, kneeling before me with bloodshot eyes, vowing, "I only want Melina, I would rather have no descendants. If I have any other intentions, may I die a terrible death." I was able to let go. For all these years, I had never burdened myself with the need for children. He kept his promise, never adding anyone to the backyard. Time flew by, and half my life had passed, yet I was still being pricked at the heart by a young girl talking about children. How ridiculous. As I helped my mother-in-law down the mountain, that girl happened to board the carriage that had come to pick her up. The carriage was grand and luxurious, rivaling that of the Grand Tutor's residence. The maidservants and servants were attentive, dutifully reminding her of what the master instructed. She was clearly a woman cherished by her husband. However, a decorative item hung at one corner of the carriage caught my eye. It was the safety token my mother-in-law had requested for Paul last month, urging him to keep it on him, yet he claimed to have lost it. My mother-in-law had clearly seen it too, as she quickly positioned herself in front of me. "Melina, I'm a bit tired. Could you help me to rest for a moment over there?" I withdrew my gaze, pretending I hadn't seen that woman's blatant attempt to pressure me. "All right." At our age, maintaining dignity is of utmost importance. The young girl didn't understand, but as the head lady of the house, I certainly did. When Paul returned, I was holding a military book, repeatedly mulling over the 36 stratagems. The best way to attack is without bloodshed, to win the heart. "Why are you reading military books again?" He casually snatched the book from my hands and held my wrist. "Are you tired today? Did you miss me?" I gazed at him in a daze, trying to find some sign of vulnerability on that face, which had been favored by time. But there was none. He had navigated through the political waters for many years, becoming steady and experienced, no longer that youth who wore his emotions on his sleeve. His deep, affectionate gaze was filled entirely with my image. Yet, a small stain on the wide sleeve of his robe betrayed him. While he wasn't paying attention, I discreetly pinched the fabric to smell it. It was crab roe. That girl had once told her maid with a blossoming face. My husband can't stand the smell of crabs, yet I just love this flavor. He promised me that when I returned home today, he would reward me with a whole bowl of crab meat he personally peeled. Returning so late, he must have gone to peel crab meat for her. I also enjoyed crab meat. Before marrying Paul, my family would roll up their sleeves and peel a whole bowl for me. Later, Paul said he couldn't stand the smell of crabs, that even from a distance, it would make his stomach churn. For his sake, I never ate crab again. By now, as I compromised for love, he had learned to embrace another's preferences and habits within love. In fact, I once had that kind of blatant affection too. At that time, I wasn't yet his wife. I casually mentioned that the green bean cake from my maternal grandparents was the softest and most fragrant, yet too far away to know when I could taste it again. He then rode day and night for 4 whole days to bring me the green bean cake from my maternal grandparents. Though I was never lacking in love, being held in the palms of my family, I was still moved by that young man's sincere and passionate concern. So many years have passed, yet Paul's way of loving someone hasn't changed one bit. Only the one he loves is no longer me. Feeling suffocated in my heart, my eyes also stung. They're all broken. His hand paused as it brushed my long hair. What? I smiled. The green bean cake you brought me that year, holding your chest, is still crumbled into bits from the long bumpy ride. Paul, do you think if we could have a child, it would be more complete? His gaze darted away in guilt. Stop thinking nonsense. If you want green bean cake, I'll have someone buy it for you tomorrow. Times have changed. I long stopped eating green bean cake. Only the innocent young girl would smile brightly at a single bite of it. As for me, I disdainfully sought traces of love in a place devoid of it. He thought I didn't know, but just a moment ago, he had gone to his mother's courtyard to give the outside woman and that unborn child a legitimate identity. His mother replied with 6 words, "Remove the mother, keep the child." Sir, there's an urgent matter at the Literature Academy. Paul glanced at me lightly. Melina, you can rest early, I will be back shortly. He wouldn't back, that was the woman's warning to me. I turned around and called over the guard from my maternal family, Landon. Anyone who explored military intelligence on the battlefield could find out anything if he wanted to. Find out where Paul has been recently. Don't make it public, and don't alert him. He looked at me in surprise. I had been married to Paul Miller for 15 years, playing together since we were young. Roughly calculating, we had been together for 30 years. I would doubt my powerful father and brothers would rebel, but I would never believe Paul Miller would betray me. It was precisely because of this that being betrayed by the one I trusted most, with a knife in the back, hurt even more. There's a spare carriage at the back door of the Literature Academy. Just follow it, and it should be easy to track. Once a person accepts reality and lets go of their emotions, their mind becomes especially clear. How could Paul spend every day at the Literature Academy while keeping a living person right under my nose? He must have snuck away from the Literature Academy. I guessed correctly. In just a few days, the girl he was hiding in the West City had all her family information laid out on my desk. She was the illegitimate daughter of my brother's former deputy, Janae Woodard. Now in her prime, she was galloping in the suburbs, having fallen into Paul's embrace. Being an illegitimate daughter was difficult, suffering from the bullying of her legitimate sister and the principal wife. Riding out of the city was her only way to survive. Paul pitied her. So much so that he brought her into his bed, preparing a 3-compound courtyard for her, with more maids and servants than I had. The young girl's love was showy and domineering. She was always eager to prove that she was more important than the aging original wife. So, on my birthday, she ran a high fever. On the memorial day of my father and brothers, she fell into the water. At my banquet, her house caught fire. Again and again, Paul was forced to choose to betray me. Even knowing I had a South Pearl hairpin granted by the Empress, she clung to Paul, demanding a pair of South Pearl earrings. Even if it wasn't the season for pearl diving, even if South Pearls were exclusively for the court, the self-disciplined Grand Tutor still went out of line, spending extravagantly to find her a large pair of pearls. It took him 3 months to personally set them in the earrings as a birthday gift for Janae Woodard. Janae had boasted before her legitimate sister that an old woman didn't deserve such a precious item. Only at her flower-like age could she hold its beauty. She repeatedly overshadowed the old woman's charm, proving time and again her position as the primary love. And Paul, all along, was fully aware and indulgent. Though I had anticipated it, the truth after the change of heart was inevitably cruel and disgusting, yet there was still a hint of hidden heartache. My youthful affections would eventually have their day of swallowing needles and swords. But I, Melina Stewart, had always refused to be at a disadvantage. You send me a needle, I will return it with a sword. Just a pair of South pearls, I have even greater treasures. It just shouldn't be that he made me pick up what others discarded. Before last year's birthday, Paul had been pestering me for a long time, asking about the popular styles, designs, and techniques of earrings in the capital. I couldn't stand his entanglement and asked him what he wanted to do. He touched his nose, feeling wronged as he quietly muttered, "I just wanted to make a pair of earrings by hand for my lady." Why can't you just pretend you don't know? I lit the lamp and carefully explained to him all night. He listened earnestly and told me to wait for his good news. I felt delightedly expectant for his surprise. But on my birthday, what he gave me was a pair of jade bracelets. When I asked about the earrings, his face stiffened and he lowered his head. My skills are lacking, it's better not to embarrass myself. He had put his heart into someone else and left me with only perfunctory gestures. Those bracelets were given to me only with the young girl's permission. I wore them every day, thinking they were filled with affection, but they were merely another person's humiliation towards me. Long ago, he took care of official business and brought her along to stay in the South for half a year. During that time, he took her on night tours of the river and carried her to the top of Yellow Mountain. He even held her in his arms, spending a passionate night on the vast Yangtze River. The places I once visited with great enthusiasm, he revisited with a beautiful new companion. The old woman who made osmanthus cake for us asked about my recent situation and congratulated him on finally getting a precious daughter, who even resembled his wife to some extent. The young girl puffed her neck and said, "I am not her daughter." The old woman who brought bad luck to her family has no such good fortune. What did Paul Miller say? Oh, he smiled and tapped her nose, teasing her for being a petty and jealous little thing, getting upset over trivial matters. Why bother speaking of others' shortcomings? Just help me bear a few more children. So I was just an unimportant other, huh? His words struck me like a painful slap, making my youthful affection shatter. Janae received clear and overwhelming love, so she proudly told the servants. What can an aging woman use to compete with me? Once I give birth to the eldest son of the Grand Tutor, she will have to obediently accept me into the household, even if she swallows a fly. Take good care of me, and also raise my son well. The young girl hung my child's wish tag around the dog's neck, smugly pouting as she asked Paul, "What about the old woman in the courtyard?" Paul paused for a moment, his tone lightening, "Not important. In the long river of time, we had arrived at a relationship that was no longer worth mentioning, parting ways without regret." What I hated was that Paul had squandered my feelings. I hated that they had mistreated my child. The abbot had clearly said that the wish tag should not leave the parent's side in order to seek a prosperous and peaceful afterlife for the wrongfully deceased child. Yet he allowed others to hang it around a dog's neck for amusement. As parents, we should plan for our children far into the future, even across lifetimes. I can only say that Paul Miller is unworthy to be the father of my child. In the night, the rain fell heavily, and I sat stiffly in the corridor, clutching at the dampness that soaked half my body. The chill and heartache nearly tore me apart. Meanwhile, my so-called husband was in another courtyard, accompanying his little girl, listening to the rain and sipping tea, dreaming of the future. He held her close, speaking softly. Mother said that if it really comes to a breaking point, the Miller family must never become extinct, and we can only cruelly remove the mother and keep the child. Of course, the principal wife would be removed, but our beloved son stays. After listening to Landon's detailed report, my heart felt as if it was being squeezed, leaving me breathless. I should have realized that after 15 years, people change. The Miller family had always been burdened by the Stewart family's life-saving grace, and dissatisfaction had long been brewing. Fearful of public opinion, they had not troubled me over the matter of heirs. But now, with a biological heir so close at hand, how could they bear to let go? And now, Paul was no longer that bright young man who rode 1,000 miles for a plate of mung bean cake. What he couldn't let go of was the family business I had brought with me. What he couldn't tolerate was the laughter of others behind his back, mocking him for not having a son to carry on the family line. What he craved was a young body and the sense of accomplishment that comes from being admired and revered. But wanting it all is simply too greedy. Even if I had been worn down by the back courtyard, it was not in my nature to swallow bitterness just to seek a compromise. That jade bracelet was shattered in the pouring rain. My feelings were in pieces. I was not the one at fault, and the damned ones were not me. Only the betrayers should swallow 1,000 needles. At dawn, Paul returned home, carrying a chill with him. The little girl had left a noticeable love mark on his neck. I pointed at that disgusting red mark and joked. The people outside are too bold. She probably doesn't know the bloodthirstiness of the Stewart family. She could die halfway and wouldn't even know why. Paul looked at the broken bracelet I had thrown, his brow twitching. I just had an allergic reaction after eating peanuts. How could the bracelet break for no reason? I replied with a faint smile, jade is fragile, it can't compare to the toughness of pearls. In comparison, I still prefer pearls. His gaze deepened, searching my face for answers. I remained unmoved, simply handing him the herbal medicine his mother drank daily. Golden osmanthus is too precious. Now that consort Selena is pregnant, she needs it herself, so I can't ask for more. Could you please make a trip to your mother? After all, 1,000 acts of carefulness can never compare to one instance of dissatisfaction. It can lose people's hearts. Paul confronted me for a while before finally taking the medicine bowl. Taking care of my mother has always been your forte. Fine, since you've come to me, I'll make the trip for you. As I watched his tall and handsome figure step out the door, I casually added, being filial and devoted is always for oneself. My 15 years of devotion were never meant to treat you all as outsiders, you shouldn't forget that. Paul looked back in surprise, but I held the teacup without giving him a glance. He left with a belly full of questions, heading to his mother's courtyard, where he would scheme for another hour. If he knew that the medicine he delivered day and night was meant to take his mother's life, would he still be able to smile? Landon had never seen the deep crimson of my hatred, hidden in the darkness, and I didn't even know where he stood. The little girl outside is so ostentatious. Since she has given me so much of a hard time, shouldn't I send a return gift? I remember that Vice General Woodard has a quick temper and can't tolerate the slightest offense. Shouldn't he do something about his daughter's disgrace? Like a gust of wind, the treetops trembled, and I knew Landon had left. That night, Paul grew wary of me under his mother's warning. Fearing that the little girl he was hiding might be found and be harmed by me, he no longer dared to run to the West City. But that little girl was too clueless, calling out to him over and over again. Watching Paul's distracted state and his frequent lapses of concentration, the ink from his writing brush fell without him noticing. I paused my writing. If you have something to do, you can go ahead. Trying to multitask like this will only lead to losing both ends. His face turned pale, and he hurriedly pulled back his thoughts. No, I've set aside a whole day just to accompany you. He said that, but less than half an hour later, under the nervous gaze of the servants, he made an excuse that he had urgent business to attend to and threw the half-copied scripture for the child at me. As I watched his hurried figure about to step out of the courtyard, I couldn't help but shout. Be careful on the slippery road in the rain, and watch every step you take. After all, at our age, it's not easy to do everything cautiously. If you really fall hard, you will lose everything. His back paused for a moment, but he resolutely continued on his way. I withdrew my gaze, my tone icy. I hope you won't do something foolish for love. Paul ultimately did not act foolishly. His little girl was stopped on the street by her legal mother and the sisters in the household, forced to kneel on the ground while being slapped, her once beautiful face quickly disfigured. The crowd around her hurled insults, reducing the little girl to nothing. What kind of mother, what kind of daughter? They are both nothing but bedwarmers. Too bad she doesn't have her mother's luck. Mrs. Woodard is generous and even gave her mother a concubine status, unlike her, who flaunts herself as a mistress all day. If it weren't for the quarrel with the young lady from the minister's family, who would know that a seductress lives in the most prosperous courtyard of the West City? The Woodard family is at least a family of generals. How could they raise such a disgrace? In an ordinary household, they would have hanged her to uphold the family honor. When she locked me up with the stocks in the back courtyard, she probably didn't expect that one day she would also be sliced by the secular knife. The little girl was insulted to the point of being unrecognizable, biting her lip, holding back tears, her long hair cascading down, weakly casting a pleading glance at Paul in the crowd. Though Paul clenched his fists tightly, he didn't heroically rescue her at the cost of his future and the Miller family's reputation. Instead, he urgently sent a message for help to Playboy Lush Heron. The slaps and insults that fell on the little girl's face turned red in Paul's eyes. By the time Mr. Heron arrived to rescue the little girl, her once bright and charming face had already become unrecognizable. Paul had long been in agony, waiting with the doctor in the small courtyard. I sat in the tea house, counting each slap, until I reached 100 and then added 20 more before I felt somewhat relieved. The old woman had her ways, and her heart was ruthless. The Woodard family's principles were sound, giving Janae Woodard a choice. Between hanging and severing ties, Janae chose the latter. With a face as swollen as a pig's, and under the pointed fingers of others, she could only pretend to be dead and be carried back to the courtyard in the West City. From then on, everything she once took pride in was branded with labels of theft and degradation. But she still didn't realize that her face had been utterly ruined by each slap. Mrs. Woodard was a decisive person. Knowing that her disgrace was a foregone conclusion, she chose to preserve the greater good. The marriages of the Woodard daughters and the futures of the men were all resolved amidst those poisonous slaps. When Paul returned to the manor in despair, I poured him tea while smiling and chatting about gossip. At such a young age, not learning to be a proper person, she has now lost all face and reputation. I fear even a concubine from a respectable family would be cleaner than her. According to what I've heard, Mr. Heron doesn't like women from brothels. How could he possibly take a liking to her? Anyone with eyes should know what kind of upbringing and background someone with such shameless behavior must have. To have mingled with her in the West City for 3 years, he must be blind. He couldn't take it anymore and slammed his teacup down. Melina, you usually keep your mouth shut. Why speak like that gossiping woman on the street, discussing others' affairs? I grabbed his hand, and when he instinctively tried to pull away upon seeing the bloodstains on his sleeve, I held on tightly. As I wiped it for him, I smiled without reaching my eyes. I'm just lamenting for the lady of the household. Such a large pile of filth has landed on her face, and just that is something she will never be able to let go of. Paul trembled, but I suddenly lifted my gaze, locking eyes with him. My husband wouldn't allow me to suffer such disgust, would he? After all, I've never been of a gentle temperament. Paul forced a strained smile. Of course not. Our feelings for each other cannot be compared to anyone else. Mother needs her medicine. I'll be right back. He fled in a panic, and I poured the tea he had drunk onto the ground. Our feelings have long since become irretrievable. She is the person you cherish now. The little girl may be hateable, but the dog who betrays her master is the one truly unforgivable. Paul hadn't left the manor for many days, and the precious medicine for the little girl did not save her flower-like face. Paul was anxious, and when I was busy praying for the child, he secretly left the manor to show his care. In a private room at the Drunken Fragrance building, the little girl, wearing a veil, cried and snuggled into Paul's arms, desperately acting cute. You said I was soft and fragrant, and you wished you could die in my embrace? How could you bear not entering my boudoir for several days? Do you dislike the scar on my face? Paul kept soothing her. Nonsense, even with a scar, you are still my irreplaceable treasure. The little girl softly hooked her arms around his neck. Sleeping beside that old woman, don't you feel disgusted or miss me? Do you know how much I miss you? Silly girl, my heart and eyes only have you and your son. Just bear with it for a while. That's a fierce woman. How could I not be careful and let you walk into the tiger's mouth? He comforted her gently, meticulously tearing duck meat into strips, delicately laying them on her plate, then smilingly feeding her mouthful by mouthful. The little girl beamed with joy at a piece of candy. Then you must not feed yourself to that mother tiger. You belong to me alone, so you can only give it all to me. As she spoke, she stood up, lifted her skirt, and twirled around. Look, does this outfit match my pearl earrings? They say these pearls are bigger and brighter than eyeballs. Next time when we get intimate, I'll have you take them off with your tongue. Paul paused in tearing the duck leg, abruptly pulling her into his embrace. Just as he was about to lean in to bite her ruby lips, he lifted his gaze and saw me smiling at the door. He was so frightened that his body stiffened, staring blankly at my smiling face, panic written all over him. At that moment, the little girl pouted, burrowing into his arms while acting coy. "You really are being ridiculous. This place is a bit too embarrassing. Then don't blame me for biting you quietly like on a boat. If the old woman finds out, don't blame me." Noticing Paul's stiffness and trembling, she opened her eyes with a teasing look. But upon seeing me, her expression froze, and she hid behind Paul. The scar on her face was decorated with lace, and a vividly painted butterfly bloomed on her cheek, adding a touch of charming allure. Such seductive tactics could keep a highborn lady occupied for a lifetime. No wonder Paul was so enamored. I stepped closer, spreading my palm in the midst of Paul's fear. "My pearl, did you give it to her? Then today, can you return it to me?" I was clearly calm and even had a hint of a smile on my lips. Yet Paul's pupils constricted, and in an instant, he stood in front of Janae, stammering at me. "Melina, how did you get here? Have you had lunch? Do you want something to eat?" The little girl timidly bit her lip, clutching Paul's clothing corner, as if afraid I wouldn't see her relationship with him. I asked again, "Will you return it to me?" Before Paul could say anything, Janae dropped to one knee in front of me. Pulling at my sleeve, she cried as if her mother had died. "It's all my fault. Sis, please don't blame my husband." I insisted on having a pair of pearl earrings as a birthday gift, forcing my husband to spend thousands of silver to get 2 pearls. "If I had known they were dear to you, sis, I would have returned them to you." "Good." She pretended to pause while taking off the earrings, staring at me in disbelief. In an instant, I seized the 2 large pearls, yanking the pair of earrings off amidst her exclamations. "Shoo!" I expressionlessly pressed a bloodied finger to her lips. "The princess and the noble lady are next door having tea. If they find out that the esteemed tutor is unwilling to teach the crown prince but is instead indulging in debauchery with a scandalous woman, the Miller family and your husband will be finished." The little girl turned pale, and the furious Paul also lost his temper. Gazing at their ashen faces, I curled my lips, but my eyes were colder than ice and snow. Mr. Miller should know that my belongings, belonging to Melina Stewart, cannot be touched by others. In his shock, I raised my hand and threw the dirty pearl earrings out the window. If others have touched them, I would rather destroy them than let them be an eyesore. He trembled slightly, wanting to say something, but I cut him off. "Tell your little girl not to misidentify her sister. This pile of filth has already splashed on my face enough. Do you expect me to hold on to it?" I turned and grasped the tearful little girl. "Next time you want to send a message for me to come see the show, you could be a bit more straightforward. I can bring more people to catch your husband in the act." Then, in a voice loud enough for both of us to hear, I whispered, "His skills in bed are only good for you." The girl I had thrown to the ground, in the cold glare of Paul, even covered her mouth to stifle her cries, fearing she would disturb others. Paul moved slightly, wanting to approach me, but under my murderous gaze, he didn't dare to move an inch. Those who have touched filthy things are dirty. In truth, the little girl had never sent anyone to find me, it was just that she disgusted me, and I naturally used Paul's hand to give her a slap. But that wasn't the most important thing. After all, an unfaithful man deserves to die 1,000 deaths. Striking hard against the weak and using soft tactics against the powerful has never been the battle style of the Stewart family on the battlefield. Half an hour later, Paul burst into my courtyard. "The princess and the lady weren't even at the tavern." "You're lying." I responded coolly, "Maybe I see it wrong?" "Who knows?" Paul was shaking with anger. "Why do you have to be so aggressive? You made Janae lose face and put her in a delicate condition. Are you happy now?" I looked up, puzzled. Does a concubine who was slapped in public still care about her reputation? "Do you know, Mr. Miller, who that shamed woman from the Woodard family carries a child for? Who else is going to fall to the point of being mocked like her?" He paled but became even more defiant. "I don't understand what you're saying. In any case, you brought trouble to Janae, making her lose her condition, and that's your fault." I couldn't help but let out a laugh. So when she crawled into my husband's arms and whispered in your ear, that was fine? All right, it's all my fault. I should have closed my eyes and not looked. After all, it was quite an eyesore. Paul, defeated, stared at me with cold brows. Men must socialize and play along when they're out. Why do you have to be so petty and lose your dignity? After all these years, even if you have no offspring, the Miller family hasn't added anyone new. You should be content. If it were someone else, you would have long been divorced. He was wrapped in ice, a fierce look I had never seen before. There was no trace of guilt or gratitude left in his eyes. I also lost my temper, so, do you want to be that someone else? To set up a concubine and give that child the status of a legitimate son? My anger could no longer be contained, turning into a cold roar. If it weren't for the Miller family's downfall back then, I wouldn't have ridden thousands of miles to the border to seek help from my father and brothers. How would that child in my belly turn to blood? The life-saving grace of the Stewart family towards the Miller family has now become your dagger aimed at me. You've truly turned gratitude into enmity and played your little role too vividly. No one asked you to do those things, using kindness to seek revenge. I've already repaid you with half my life, and you shouldn't make the Miller family extinct. We parted on bad terms, and Paul slipped into his mother's courtyard. Landon emerged. If you want a divorce, even if the Lord and young master are gone, the Stewart family will not let you suffer. I shook my head with a cold smile. A divorce? Everything the Miller family has now was obtained through my father's and brother's merits. If I leave, I should bring them back to their original state. I withdrew my gaze and took a breath. 10 days, just 10 days, and I won't have to endure any longer. Before that, I should first eliminate the Miller family's strategist. After all, without Mrs. Miller, the old fox, playing with the inexperienced Paul would be like crushing an ant. One should withdraw from the mud in time to prevent further losses. The feelings entangled in the past only trap the present self. Who can guarantee that their feelings will always be smooth sailing? Even walking can lead to stumbling, let alone entrusting one's life to another. I would never regret my past choices. After all, 15-year-old Paul truly loved 15-year-old Melina. 15-year-old Melina merely made the choice that was most desired at that age. What's wrong with loving someone? Should one be condemned to a grave for making a wrong choice when young? The mistake lies in knowing it's wrong yet persisting in the error. I was having tea at the tea house, accompanied by the lady of the court. If you've been wronged, don't endure it. At worst, get a divorce. If the Stewart family can't support you, I will. I couldn't help but laugh. Divorce and let someone else take my place? As long as I'm in this position, no one can easily step in. After all, everyone in the capital knows about the life-saving grace I offered to the Miller family. They swore to cherish me wholeheartedly. A newcomer wanting to enter? Unless she also has a life-saving grace towards the Miller family. The lady shook her head. Unless someone saves the old lady's life, with filial piety pressing down, only then could you, Melina, lower your head and let a newcomer into the household. Otherwise, any act of betrayal, once impeached, would not only cost Paul his position but likely make the entire Miller family unable to hold their heads high. I smiled faintly. Exactly. Janae, who was just a door away, heard this. So, she and Paul plotted to stage a life-saving grace while Mrs. Miller went out of the city to worship. Usually accompanied by me, Mrs. Miller refused my company and even brought only 2 accompanying old maids to avoid any loopholes. Paul watched his mother get into the carriage, the corners of his mouth betraying a smile. Thanks to my mother's monthly worship, the Miller family has enjoyed peace and prosperity for over a decade. I smiled without replying. For 15 years, the protection of the Stewart family and my painstaking efforts had turned into divine blessing in Paul's words. Let's see today if her mother's misfortune can attract divine protection. I didn't need to pray to the gods. I entered the palace, enjoying tea and flowers with my cousin, Consort Selina, and we chatted all day. Since becoming pregnant, Consort Selina had been especially cautious. When I accompanied her, no one was allowed to disturb us. So when I stepped back home under the fading sunset, the news of Mrs. Miller's near drowning reached my ears. Even though I rushed back with the physician immediately, it was too late to save Mrs. Miller, who was disoriented and paralyzed on one side. The physician regretted. The old lady switched the golden osmanthus jade for silver osmanthus jade. Although the effects are not much different, there are many taboos, especially against getting cold. Now that her body has soaked in cold water and treatment was delayed, she can only recover slowly. She must not have any great emotional fluctuations, otherwise, it would be futile. The physician left. I ignored Paul's cold expression. She was only going to worship. How could she fall into the water for no reason? Paul opened his mouth but didn't respond. After all, under their scheme, the bandit blocked the road, and Janae drew her sword to help. Though she suffered minor injuries, she completely saved Mrs. Miller. With the life-saving grace completed, I only had to grit my teeth and bring her into the household. But unexpectedly, the bandit was real, and Janae fled at the critical moment. Mrs. Miller was saved by the accompanying maids. She had no way but to jump into the water to save her life. Fortunately, she could swim, otherwise, today the Miller family would be draped in mourning. Paul's anger had no outlet, and he used official business as an excuse to West City. That night, cries echoed in the courtyard of West City. After being slapped, the little girl knelt on the ground, begging for mercy, and only then did she realize to point her finger at me. It was Melina Stewart. It was all her plotting. If she hadn't lured me to the Miller residence with the life-saving grace, and then had everyone I invited killed in that broken temple, the old lady wouldn't have been hurt. Paul, you must believe I truly ran away to protect our child. It was her who wanted to get rid of the old lady and used your hand to eliminate us mother and son. You can't fall for her tricks. Paul's hand tightened around the cup, the veins on his hand bulging. Good old Melina Stewart, all these years, I underestimated you. You have no mercy. Do not blame me for being unfeeling. I couldn't help but sneeze. Is someone keeping an eye on me? What bad luck. Paul feared that his girl would fall victim to my schemes, wrapping layers of protection around her in the courtyard of West City. I shrugged, indifferent. When someone else is taking action, why should I dirty my own hands? There are still 2 days left before the 10th day. I can wait. But Paul couldn't wait. That night, he left the residence under the pretext of accompanying the Crown Prince for night study. I tightly held down the uninjured leg of Mrs. Miller, smiling as she cried in pain. Paul is working day and night for the future and major affairs of the Miller family. Mother shouldn't cling to him. She sobbed, watching Paul walk away. The illegitimate daughter I brought home, Sherry Miller, smirked coldly as she forced hot medicinal soup into Mrs. Miller's mouth. With tears streaming down her face and eyes pleading, Mrs. Miller could only watch as Sherry showed no mercy. I've been ground down and mistreated by my husband's family. Being treated like a beast is truly worse than death. This is the good marriage you chose for me only to pave for brother. I want a divorce, just a nod from you, and I would be endlessly grateful. Yet you insist on pushing me to the edge. Melina says it well, relying on others is not as good as relying on oneself. After I take care of you, she will give me my freedom. So, you must be good and don't make it difficult for me, nor distract brother. After all, his plan to kill cannot be delayed. Mrs. Miller was terrified but couldn't utter a word. Sherry and I exchanged glances, both seeing determination in each other's eyes. That night, the courtyard was far from peaceful. After one bowl of tea, I fainted. The maid who had served me for 10 years quietly dismissed all the other girls and then opened the back door. When she brought in the man with the scruffy head, she found that the person sleeping in the bed was gone. She panicked and lifted the quilt, and I stood behind her, smiling. Are you looking for me? The scruffy-headed man was stunned when he turned back and was knocked out by my quick strike. Then, the lights brightened, illuminating the pale face of the maid Tara. What are you doing, madam? Why aren't you sleeping at this late hour, attracting everyone to the courtyard? Sherry stepped out from behind the man, naturally, to catch the traitor. You shouldn't be like your sister, disloyal to your master. Melina is not like my mother, you can't scheme against her. Before Tara could argue, she was dragged away, tightly bound. When Paul rushed in with a lantern to catch the adulterer, I was just playing chess with Sherry under the light. As a piece fell, she lost the entire game. Indeed, Melina, your plotting hasn't diminished over the years, always thinking 5 steps ahead. I concede my defeat willingly. Paul was frozen at the door, his deep, affectionate eyes scanning the room. I raised an eyebrow and deliberately asked, "Are you looking for Tara?" He suppressed his panic. "Not at all. I merely saw that the lights in your courtyard were bright and came to check. If there's nothing, I shall head to the study." "Wait!" He turned back. Tara was caught in the act with an outsider, violating the rules of the household. The family law has already been carried out. As I spoke, I clapped my hands. A bloodied corpse was dragged before Paul. He staggered back 3 steps, unable to hold back his nausea at the sight of the mangled flesh. If I hadn't been prepared, that rotten flesh would be mine now. There are very few women from noble families who have lost their reputations and can survive like his girl. Even seeking a divorce in this world is exceptionally difficult. I am not the one who made a mistake. Why should I bear the stigma that would implicate the younger generation of my family? Thus, Paul and I are destined to be at odds until the end. I smirked and waved my hand, and the corpse was taken away. The adulterer has been sent to the authorities. After all, he came to my courtyard. I must understand the details. Paul's expression changed drastically. "No." Meeting my deep gaze, he awkwardly explained. "The privacy of the residence should not be revealed to the public. For the sake of reputation, you should quickly stop the matter and execute him to preserve our name." "You are right, but dealing with the authorities is your forte. Why not go yourself?" He clenched his fists, gritting his teeth in response. With the orders from our Stewart family, Paul could only face setbacks in the officialdom. As a high-ranking official, it was almost impossible for him to rescue someone from prison. He was in a state of panic, fearing that his dirty deeds would be exposed in front of others. So, taking advantage of his distraction, I met with his girl. She was forced to kneel in front of me, biting her lip and glaring at me with hatred. "Was it you who put my child's wish token on a dog's neck? If your child dies a terrible death, is that not retribution?" Her face turned pale, instinctively protecting her belly. I asked again, "Was the dog that Paul sent to the estate also drowned by you in the well?" She swallowed hard and trembled as she replied, "I don't understand what you're saying, madam." "I can report you for trespassing." I nodded, "Indeed. However, if this house was bought by Paul, that's another matter. Does an old woman have the right to reclaim the Miller family's properties?" Her face turned white, yet she stubbornly protested. "What of the Miller family's properties? Now that I carry Paul's child, everything of the Miller family belongs to my child. What does it matter that you are the madam? Jealous, unfilial, and childless, why do you think you can keep me from entering the estate?" I gasped, "How can it be that I won't let you enter the estate? Paul has never mentioned allowing you in." Her blood drained from her face, her eyes filled with disbelief. "Don't try to sow discord. Paul wouldn't lie to me. It's you, old woman, who refuses to let me in. I thought you were clever, but it turns out you're quite foolish. I overestimated you. Have you thought about it? Damaging your reputation and harming his mother, how could he ever let you in? You're just a pawn in a game for a son for me, a noble lady. You're not even worthy to be my opponent." I truly wasted my time. I turned and left with a cold laugh. After the girl cursed and went mad, she took a 3-foot white silk and hanged herself to enter the Miller estate. Paul, in a state of panic, still had the second lady of the Miller family come to persuade me. She urged me to be magnanimous, to turn a blind eye, and to let a small sedan chair be carried in first. I, however, used the pretext of religious beliefs to block her outside the door, while I sharpened my knife in front of the Buddha. My dog died as it did, and Paul must avenge it to appease me. That said, considering our 15 years of marriage, I could be lenient. The women of the Miller family, holding themselves as elders, were met with a closed door. After they began to criticize me with all sorts of accusations, they finally left with a harsh remark, "Don't regret it." Overnight, the entire Miller family was in an uproar. Years of filial piety went unnoticed, but one day of coldness was known to all. They labeled me unfilial, childless, and jealous. They even threatened that if I didn't pour tea and apologize, I would be removed from the Miller family genealogy. Their behavior was meant to make me feel guilty, with no way out, forcing me to comply and let them manipulate me. At that point, concubines or outside women would naturally enter the courtyard. I had no idea that the members of the Miller family who usually flattered me had such faces. Not only had they forgotten my life-saving grace, but even while enjoying their current wealth, they dared to call themselves elders in front of me, demanding that I bow and apologize. The shamelessness after feelings have run dry is even more disgusting. But I did not stop. I even added fuel to the fire, placing the memorial that impeached my general's estate in the emperor's study. I was besieged on all sides, trapped with no way to retreat, as if I had no choice but to endure and give in. At this moment, Paul appeared again. He brought medicine, pretending to feel guilty, and spoke soothingly. "Melina, don't make a scene anymore, it's bad for your reputation. The general's estate has 100 years of reputation, it cannot be harmed because of you alone. Give my son a legitimate title, and I can overlook the past." "Oh. Your concubine has become the principal wife?" The Miller family really goes to great lengths for their descendants. As he tried to argue, I slapped him across the face, hitting his shamelessness. "How dare you mention the general's estate? Your shame and your vows of loyalty have rotted in the courtyard on West City." The high-ranking Grand Tutor was suddenly filled with rage from the unexpected slap. "Do you think the current general's estate can be compared to the past? You've held your high and mighty facade, acting as if you've done me a favor your whole life. Aren't you tired? I've spent my whole life repaying you, what more do you want? Do you really want me to become childless? What's wrong with a man having multiple wives? If you were a man, you'd probably have a harem by now. Yet you force me to be a saint, you're the one who has strayed and is beyond redemption." From his bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, I finally heard his heartfelt words. "Now that Janae is pregnant, whether you agree or not, the children of the Miller family must acknowledge their roots." I did not argue. Under his furious gaze, I gripped his neck and gently stroked his reddened cheek where I had slapped him. He wanted to escape, but I held him firmly in place. "So, has Mr. Miller forgotten the vow made in the palace?" "I think everyone in the palace hasn't forgotten. You've broken your vow. If heaven doesn't let you die, what if I want to? Do you think the emperor will agree?" He was terrified, shocked, and in disbelief. At this point, Mr. Miller seems to have forgotten that I, Melina Stewart, have never been a virtuous person. My father and brothers have made great contributions to the country, the steadfast Stewart family can make small requests, and the emperor won't deny us. The Miller family was originally filled with criminals, and everything now is under the protection and gifts of the Stewart family. And which member of the ruthless Stewart family is a living Buddha? In my deep gaze, Paul saw only endless coldness and hatred. He didn't expect me to be so resolute, unwilling to give an inch, even if it meant mutual destruction. He was stunned on the spot, but I fixed my gaze and pushed him onto the high official's chair, shoving the bowl of medicine into his hands. "Don't force me to make your girl lose both her life and child." He was filled with dread and fled with the bowl of medicine in his arms. From then on, he didn't dare to confront me directly but secretly plotted to deliver a fatal blow to me. Ideally, I would be unable to turn the tide in front of the royal family. This opportunity one willingly handed to him. The princess hosted a poetry gathering, inviting Madame Carter from the censorate, Madame Newey from the Duke's residence, and Madame Ledger from the Minister of Right's household. The turmoil from the Miller family had spread throughout the capital, and I had become the most pitiful principal wife in everyone's eyes. They gathered around the stove, brewing tea to comfort and console me. But I remained expressionless. They even sent for Paul and the various gentlemen. Before my tea was ready, the door was suddenly pushed open. Janae dropped to her knee in front of me, tears streaming down her face, saying, "Please, madam, think of the child and let me." She was interrupted midway, frozen in place. Because in this spacious tea room, I was the only one present. To present herself in front of the other ladies, using the child in her belly to pressure and embarrass me, had left her dumbfounded. But under my mocking smile, her facade crumbled, and she suddenly stood up, saying, "You shameless woman, what do you have to be proud of? At 30, you're already past your prime, half your body has one foot in the grave, yet you've done so much evil and have such a short life, you deserve to die. Your father and brothers have also died, and your son is short-lived. Now, the fallen general's residence can't support you at all. With your age, you'll die without a son to see you off. Why shouldn't I be allowed to enter the Miller family?" She was hysterical, and in her agitation, her hairpin fell askew. I walked over step by step, smiling as I grasped her chin, and as she gasped, I helped her straighten up, saying, "So after being a mistress for 3 years, you finally want a position?" Even going so far as to design a savior's role, causing the old lady to be bedridden and yet not repent? She glared at me fiercely. "So what? Paul is willing to trust me. What can you do about it? A hen that doesn't lay eggs can occupy the position of high wife? On what grounds?" I looked outside at Paul and asked with interest, "Paul, what do you think?" Paul stood outside the door, his face cold as frost. The accompanying lush heron pretended to be relaxed, turning his head to act as if he couldn't see. Upon seeing Paul, Janae immediately changed her demeanor. "Darling, she says she wants to kill me and my child, saying she would rather die than let me into the Miller family." "Darling, I don't care, as long as you love me and cherish me, I'll be fine with anything." "But what about the child? I've spent my whole life being bullied as a concubine. I don't want my child to be even worse off than I am. He deserves to have his own father and his own home." Paul looked at me deeply. "Melina has worked hard for our Miller family. How can you poke at her sore spot?" Janae turned her head, clutching my sleeve. "Sis, I was wrong. I apologize. I'll bow to you, just please." I pulled my hand away from her grip, and she fell forward, her belly hitting the edge of the tea table. Paul rushed over, holding her in his arms. The beauty wept, truly heart-wrenching. "Darling, it hurts so much. She didn't mean it, don't blame her. She just lost her child and doesn't want my child with you. Please don't blame her. Aw, it hurts so much. Call the imperial physician, hurry and call the physician." He was panicking, thinking he was the emperor, wanting to summon the imperial physician. My sarcasm was unmasked. He grew more disgusted. "I always thought that you were pretending to be noble or repaying a favor, and you were still a daughter of a general. But I didn't expect that you were even more hateful than the women fighting in the harem. For the sake of my child, for the sake of the Miller family's roots, I will divorce you." Mr. Heron hurried to stop him, but it was too late. Paul had finished his harsh words. "The thing I regret most in this life is marrying you. If the Miller family has no descendants, you, Melina Stewart, are the greatest sinner. Without children, being jealous and unfilial, it's not too much for me to divorce you." Mr. Heron was so anxious he was hopping. "Be careful with your words." But I was straightforward, pulling out the divorce papers I had prepared long ago. "Divorce me? You're not qualified. A mutual consent divorce is your best option. I'll take the child I lost for the Miller family as my retribution, but I'm waiting to see your retribution." Thinking he could use the divorce to take my Stewart family's wealth, his Miller family's calculations had gone awry. At that moment, Paul finally understood my inevitable victory. Severing ties with him and the Miller family after more than 10 years of affection was not his choice but my Melina's strategy. The outcome of a mutual consent divorce would mean the Stewart family's assets would be returned to the Stewart residence. By then, the Miller family would have nothing. His gaze darkened, and he unconsciously tightened his hold on Janae. "You think you can? I'll be the one to divorce you. There's no possibility of a mutual consent divorce. You've acted immorally, being dismissed would be a favor to you." In an instant, the screens separating the spaces were pushed aside. On the left and right, 2 tea rooms were occupied by Madame Carter, Madame Newey, the Princess, and Madame Ledger, along with Lord Carter, Lord Newey, the Duke, and Lord Ledger. Indulging a mistress to confront the legitimate wife, and before even entering the residence, you spoil concubines and neglect your wife. "Mr. Miller, you pride yourself on your integrity, yet it turns out you can't distinguish right from wrong." The princess pulled me to her side. "That shameless woman insulted Melina the moment she entered, showing great disrespect to the general and his son. If I don't punish her today, people will think the royal family is heartless and ungrateful, forgetting the blood spilled by the Stewart family and the countless merits the Stewart family has for the country. Come, take her away, whip her 50 times, and throw her into the prison to await the emperor's decree." I had been married to him for 15 years, how could I not know his schemes and tactics? He believed he was invincible like Jing Ku attempting to assassinate King Qin, but he had stumbled into my carefully arranged trap. He wanted me to hesitate, to grit my teeth and acknowledge his girl in front of the officials. He underestimated me too much. Melina, what are you trying to do? I, the Miller family, have never treated you poorly in these 15 years. Do you really want us to become extinct? The second madam of the Miller family arrived just in time. Madam has been listening next door for so long, you must have heard how that shameless woman insulted Melina. But you allowed her to distort the truth in front of your nephew. Why didn't you speak up for Melina back then? Now, for the sake of your Miller family's good grandson, you are willing to speak up? Madame Nui is my aunt from the clan. She has never looked up to the Miller family, which relies on concubines. Even as the second madam of the Miller family was so furious she trembled, she wouldn't let it go. If I had known the Miller family had such a family culture and upbringing, I should have advised General Stewart and the young general at that time. Why bother kneeling in front of the Emperor's hall for 3 whole days for such a family? If they knew from the underworld that this white-eyed wolf has humiliated their daughter and sister, they would rise as vengeful spirits and demand your heads. Paul turned pale with every word Lady Nui spoke, and by the end, he could barely lift his head. He had forgotten the scene of the entire Miller family kneeling outside the Stewart family's door to express their gratitude after 15 years of peace. He had also forgotten the kindness shown to them during their time of need. Betrayal, bullying, and even humiliation were the rewards the Miller family had given me. Lord Nui laid a confession coldly before Paul. In an instant, all color drained from his face. Collaborating with a foreign man to scheme against your own wife, I doubt there's a second person in the whole country as shameless as this. Such conduct may lead to a bad influence on His Highness the Crown Prince. Paul stood frozen, unconsciously casting a pleading glance towards me, but I handed over the divorce papers. Sign here. The person in his arms shrank back at my gesture. Do as you wish. He lifted his gaze to meet mine. Those deep, affectionate eyes that once sparkled at the sight of beauty shone when I agreed to marry him and were swollen with grief after losing a child. Yet, they were now filled with hesitation and regret. A middle-aged man, too, had to face reality. He needed heirs and wished for his backyard to bloom with flowers and greenery. But he also couldn't bear to let go of a wife of good standing, who could help him solve troubles and support him. Melina, is there really no other choice? I shook my head. There's no turning back. This is the most dignified way to part. You should know this. Even if you can't bear to part from the power of the Stewart family, you should understand my temperament as Melina Stewart. In public, to insult him by coveting the power of the Stewart family, he would choose divorce to maintain a shred of pride. His pupils contracted, and the beauty in his arms trembled, but he finally nodded. With that, the decision was made. The Miller and Stewart families were henceforth separated. But what awaited the Miller family was a fate worse than death. The dowry given to me by my parents and the rewards from the palace, all the efforts I had made over the years, I took with me. People praised my unwavering spirit, not yielding to family traditions. Yet, the morally corrupt Miller family, once well off, suddenly faced financial ruin. Even the children of the Miller family, studying in the capital, were sent home without books to read. And the esteemed tutor, who was about to ruin his wife's reputation because of a concubine, was impeached, ridiculed, and dismissed from office, only to be publicly humiliated. At this moment, they remembered that Paul's position as tutor was granted by the emperor out of pity for my father and brothers. The women of the Miller family cursed. A thankless wolf, a wolf that cannot be raised, this is pushing the Miller family to their doom. Without money, without livelihood, this large family cannot even survive on porridge. Paul dared not say much. After the Miller family was confiscated, they had lost everything. Everything the Miller family had afterward was given by the Stewart family. Melina never mentioned it, so they all assumed it was what the Miller family deserved. No wonder she devised a plan to divorce, it was to cut off the roots and step on the Miller family back to their original state. Then, to watch them live worse than dogs, even begging her for help. Paul felt a surge of anger. It's fine. Janae in the West City has saved a lot of good things over the years, the Miller family isn't completely destitute. I refuse to believe the Miller family can't survive without Melina Stewart. But Janae insists on carrying her in a grand sedan chair. What do you all think? The Miller family members instantly perked up. If she resolves the Miller family's problems and can bear a legitimate son for us, then let it be a grand sedan chair. That's perfect, it would slap the face of the Stewart girl. But they didn't realize they were digging their own graves. However, when they took their meager belongings to the small courtyard in the West City, they found it already empty, the courtyard sold at a low price to merchants. Janae Woodard had used heavy medicine to treat her facial scars, burning all bridges. Even if the unborn child were to be born, it would either die or be severely harmed. Now that the Miller family had fallen, why should she spend her own savings to support a large family? She fled the capital overnight with her belongings. Unfortunately, the luxurious carriage attracted the attention of bandits. As soon as they reached the outskirts of the city, she was captured. The methods and tortures in Blade Edge Village turned her into a broken, bloodied corpse within 3 days. Well done, Landon. Having you as my father's gift to me is the greatest wealth left for me. Perhaps I was mistaken, but my praise brought a slight blush to the iron-faced Landon. The next day, Sherry and I sat in the corridor watching the boats. The Miller family has no hope of turning their fortunes around now. Melina, you are truly impressive. Impressive at what? Just a concubine, eliminating her unnoticed was a piece of cake. The reason it had dragged on until now was merely to deliver a fatal blow to the Miller family. After all, the aphrodisiac she added to Paul's tea daily, combined with my tea, could truly render him childless. I had said long ago, I lost my child for the Miller family, I wouldn't let him step on my pain to have a house full of children. I don't know when it started, but rumors began circulating in the streets, claiming that the principal wife of the Miller family bore no children. And it was Paul Miller who had harmed his lineage during the family's misfortune, unrelated to Melina Stewart. Paul could not bear such slander and sought the best doctor in public. The result was a thunderbolt to him. Paul had harmed his roots and would have no descendants. He refused to believe it and consulted countless doctors, only to receive the same conclusion. Paul trembled all over and fell to the ground. All his plans for heirs became a joke. He repeatedly claimed Melina bore no children, treating her companionship as a reward, only to have it backfire right in his face. The Miller family had initially abandoned wealth and glory for heirs, parting ways with the Stewart family, and had even been praised for their noble spirit by scholars. Now, being small-minded after their downfall, they were truly trampled upon by everyone. Even the Miller family members parted ways, taking the little money left back to the ancestral home in El City. When Mrs. Miller heard the news, she was heartbroken and died from anger. How could the proud Paul withstand the scorn of thousands? He became like a stray dog, holding his head in despair. Yet, he was still pursued and ridiculed. Mental torment far surpassed physical suffering. The once-spirited Paul Miller was now worn and haggard, looking old beyond his years. He could hardly express his pain and decided to head south back to El City. Before he left, he knelt outside the Stewart residence, begging for a chance to see me. Holding the shattered white jade bracelet and the pearl earrings he had fought to reclaim after getting his leg broken. He spoke each word with a heart full of sorrow, recounting his debts and failures towards me. He pleaded for me to give him a chance, recalling my dedicated efforts and sincere plans for him and the Miller family. It turned out that he had been aware of all my sacrifices over the past 15 years. But when faced with a more self-serving choice, he was utterly blind. In the end, he did not seek my forgiveness, he only wanted to see me to personally apologize. The fierce winds and rains battered his frail form, but I did not meet him. The wayward man, abandoned by all, sought redemption, but I was not his mother, I would not offer forgiveness or tolerance. Holding Sherry's divorce papers, I prepared her travel bag. Are you really going to South City? You might as well come with me to the northern desert. She shook her head. You will honor General Stewart's legacy, and I will fulfill my mother's unfulfilled wishes. We must part with smiles, even if our paths are divergent. If you are reluctant, I should cry. I couldn't help but laugh, stuffing money I had scavenged from the Miller family into her bag. A girl's happiness should come from fulfilling herself. May your life be filled with blossoms, may you live freely. Such a good girl should not be anyone's sacrifice to gain power. She should be like a free wind, carrying the scent of flowers, blowing through any corner she wishes to go. On the 5th day of Sherry's journey south, her treacherous husband found me. If Sherry Miller admits her mistakes, she can apologize to Emma. I can forgive her and take her back home, giving her a place as a proper wife. Otherwise, given the current situation of the Miller family, even as a concubine, no one would dare take her in. With a long spear, I struck him, leaving him with a bruised face. Who is this mad dog, daring to bark wildly at the Stewart family? Don't mention that Sherry has already signed the divorce agreement and doesn't want you anymore. Even if she hasn't signed the divorce agreement, I will go before the emperor and ask for her freedom. Such a despicable person. If you want to see Sherry, wait until your next life. When I threw the heir of Prince out of the residence, he still shouted in disbelief. It's impossible. She's just a lowly illegitimate daughter, being the heir's wife is a fortune she could never hope for. Why would she not want me? You lied to me, I want to see her. I must see her. After the heavy door closed, I packed my bags to head to the borders where my father and brothers had once guarded. Landon stood behind me, his lips pressed together, a hint of barely noticeable amusement in his eyes. I suddenly turned around. Are you pleased with yourself? He looked flustered. You broke Paul's limbs behind my back and threw him on a merchant ship, letting him fight with beggars in the southern barbarians' land. Do you think I didn't know? He lowered his head, too afraid to reply. You did well, you were one step ahead of me. The best revenge against someone so self-important is to take away everything they cherish. If he wants 100 sons and thousands of descendants, I want him to be childless. If he yearns to rise high and be a dragon among men, I will step on him, making him live worse than a beggar with all his limbs intact. Death would be too kind. A life worse than death is the true torment. Day after day, he will regretting that he ruined the glory and wealth that were within his grasp. Swallowing needles daily will be his punishment. Landon looked at me with admiration, but I splashed cold water on his enthusiasm. But you still held back, you should have gouged out his eyes. What use are eyes to someone so blind? Should I rush over and finish the job? I stifled a laugh and tossed the package into his hands. We're heading north tomorrow, there's no time for such leisure.